So today I'm going to be talking about the Nazi dictatorship going from 1933 to 1939. So last module ended up right in the middle of the transition between democracy and dictatorship. So ended up with the Enabling Act. So now I'm going to start with the legal revolution. So the KPD, how were they seen as an obstacle to NASDAQ? Well, they were growing quite fast. They were the main form of opposition, and they actually stopped NASDAQ from passing laws in the Reichstag. Well, the way they were controlled was by those who had not already been arrested or imprisoned just went into exile. And KPD was officially banned on the 6th of March 1933. Then the SPD was also an obstacle to the Nazis because, well, they stood up to Hitler in the Reichstag, especially in the Enabling Act debate. And again, they publicly voiced opposition to NASDAQ. The way they were controlled, well, they were eventually outlawed as a party hostile to the nation and state. Now, if you ask me, NASDAQ is a party hostile to the nation and state, but whatever. And they were banned on the 22nd of June, 1933. So other political parties, such as the MVP and CCP, but they were also seen as an obstacle because they were in the way of Nazis passing policies. And the way in which these were controlled were by, they actually dissolved themselves. The MVP, most of them joined the Nazi party. Some were put in concentration camps, and then the whole law against the establishment of political parties was passed. So the dates on CCP they dissolved themselves on the 5th of May 1933. The DNVP dissolved themselves on the 27th of June 1933. Concentration camps were established in March 1933, and the law against establishment for political parties was passed on the 14th of July 1933. Then, workers' trade unions. Well, they were seen as an obstacle because they were left-wing and gave ordinary people too much control and too much power. The way in which they were controlled, well, they were abolished, and the workers were made to join the German Labor Front or the DAF. That's the same thing. I'm going to talk about this more in a second. And, well, this all happened on the 2nd of May, 1933. Then the whole left-wing press. Well, they were seen as an obstacle because they voiced opposition to any of Hitler's or the Nazi Party's actions, and they spread anti-Nazi sentiment. The way in which they were controlled was through the use of censorship, and this was, well, around 1934. And then state governments, well, the way they were an obstacle to the Nazi regime, well, they could operate independently from the central government. They could kind of do not what they wanted, but in a different way, which obviously didn't go against. They obviously went against what the Nazis wanted. Well, the way in which they were controlled in Prussia, Goering was sent to head that up, so he was running the Prussian government. Also, the law for the coordination of the federal states was passed. Larger parliaments were all abolished, and Gauleiters were installed, which reported directly to Berlin. Now, Gauleiters does not mean government official. It means Nazi party leader. For the way you can remember this was because Nazis came into power in 1933, but Gauleiters had been present years before. For example, Goebbels, he had been Gauleiter of Berlin since, if I'm not mistaken, 1926 or 28. One of those two. So he had been Gauleiter way before. It shows how Gauleiter does not mean Nazi party official in a state. It means head of Nazi party in an area. On dates, well, Goering was appointed governor of Prussia on the 31st of March 1933. The law for the coordination of the federal states was passed on the 7th of April 1933. So this day in 1933. And Gauleiters, well, they were mostly being established from January 1934 onwards. Then we have the civil service. The way in which these were an obstacle to the Nazi regime was because they were an obstacle to the exercise of dictatorial power. The way in which they were controlled, well, the law for the restoration of professional civil service was passed. Also, the establishment of the People's Court and the Gestapo, and some people and some workers were forced to resign. And this again was passed on the 7th of April 1933. So this day, but in 1933. the Catholic Church, and I'm going to talk about the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church in a second, but they were an obstacle because the answer to the Pope, not to Hitler, in which they were controlled, was with the Concordat, which I'll say it once, I'll say it again, is the most useless piece of paper I've ever seen. I have not seen it, but it's useless. But it said that the NASDAQ would not attack the church if the church promised to leave NASDAQ alone. This was signed by Pius XI, but under the Council of Future Pius XII. And this was passed on the 20th of July, 1933, which coincidentally happens to be my birthday, so that's that. Then, other political opponents. The way they posed an obstacle to the Nazi regime was because they were just a threat, and they could raise support against NASDAQ. The way in which they were controlled were through political assassinations, especially in the Night of the Long Knives. The date was 30th of June 1934, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. So, two of the Nazis' general ideas were Volksgemeinschaft and Gleichschaltung. Volksgemeinschaft was a state based on racial community where only Aryans could be citizens, and Gleichschaltung was making everything to the same. So, one-party state. So, the Night of Long Knives. Why did Hitler turn on the SA? Well, Rome believed in the left-wing idea of a second revolution. Hitler didn't. The SA was the left-wing part of the left-wing section of the Nazi Party. He would turn on the SA. He would win the support of those who were scared of him and the SA. He was starting to wipe homosexuality from the party because homosexuality was a disease, and he obviously had to get rid of it. And it didn't help that Rome, the leader of the SA, was homosexual. So, oh God, he had to kill Rome and rid homosexuality before it went too far. Well, Rome actually wanted to merge the SA with the army in order to gain more men and more weapons. The SA, by the way, were 3 million people strong. The regular German army was just 100,000. That's 30 times larger than the army. Also, by turning on the left-wing part of his party, the SA, he would gain support of a lot of people in the right wing. Also, von Papen realized Hitler wasn't being the puppet they thought he was. And, well, Hitler didn't want these groups gaining Hindenburg support, so that would just endanger Hitler's position as chancellor. Also, Goering led Hitler to believe that Rome was planning a coup. The SA, they were useful in the first stages in actually coming to power, intimidation, and the Munich push. But now they were not that useful. Also, Himmler had founded the SS, which was inside the SA, and wanted to make the SS independent. And these members of the SA had a loyalty to Rome rather than to Hitler himself. And the famous casualties of the Night of the Long Knives were obviously Rome, Gregor Strasser. It's important to note how it's Gregor Strasser, not Otto Strasser. Then von Schleicher, who was involved in the Baxter's intrigue. Von Kahr, who was in the Munich push, who had betrayed Hitler. And other around between 90 and 200 people. So, the final part in achieving dictatorship, the death of Hindenburg. Now, he died on the 2nd of August 1934, and Hitler managed to get Hindenburg to sign the law on his deathbed. There's photos of this. The man was dying and they made him sign a law. Well, it started saying that the Reich government has enacted the following law, which is hereby promulgated. There were two sections in this law. The first one being that the office of Reich President would be combined with that of the Reich Chancellor. That meaning that the authority of President would be transferred to the Führer and the Reich Chancellor, in this case Hitler. And he would select his deputy, which at first was Hess, but then, then it was Bormann, I think. Anyway. The second section did say that this was effective at the time of death of Hindenburg. So the second Hindenburg died, there was Führer, and the democracy was dead, essentially. So that is a transition from democracy to dictatorship. And now we are going to look at the police state. So there are 4 groups, well, not 4 groups, I think it's 6, 7, a bunch of groups that form this police state. And I like to call this area, like this part, the age of Himmler, because it really shows how powerful Himmler was at this time. So, first group, the SS. The commander, Heinrich Himmler. The purpose was to be Hitler's personal guard, and they were brutal and just used plain violence. They were really systematic and used many different techniques to try to inflict terror. There were 2 types: the normal SS, and then once they started moving into other territories, the Waffen SS. And they also controlled the concentration camps. And the members, well, they had to be completely Aryan. There was a process they had to go through to enter the SS, and they upheld the Nazi views of racial supremacy. They were completely dehumanized, very aggressive, and disciplined, and racially pure. Then we have the SD. The commander is Heydrich, but the SD is under the wing of the SS, so technically Heydrich answers to Himmler. Now, fun fact before I tell you about the SD, when Heinrich was being interviewed by Himmler, Himmler asked, "What are your ideas as to how the SD can work?" Well, Heydrich was a huge movie fan of like spies. He liked spy movies, so he based all his ideas on spy movies, and that's why when in movies you don't see the SS, this movie is like Gestapo, but like the SS as well. They are like really movie spies, but the thing is that's not inaccurate because that's how they were based. Because Heydrich based the whole SD structure on movies. So the SD. Well, the purpose was they were the secret police. They gathered information and mostly internal security service. They were completely independent from the Gestapo, and they gathered public opinion and gained information. The members, they were less trained, they were amateurs, and they were committed to the Nazi party. Now, the Gestapo and the SD can get confused, but they're not the same thing. When I finish talking about the Gestapo, I'll tell you the difference. And the SD, they will also be analytical and evaluated data. Now, the Gestapo, at first it was Goering, but once Goering was made governor of Prussia, the authority of the Gestapo was sent to, you guessed it, Heinrich Himmler. The purpose, they were omnipresent. There were only 20,000, although there were only 20,000 by 1939, and only really 1% of the population came in contact with them. But as you can see in movies, they're almost everywhere. Those are omnipresent and omnipotent. They knew everything and they were everywhere. They were the professional secret police. They didn't work for the Nazis, they worked for the state. They tracked opponents and minorities, and they gained intelligence, and they were run, like I said, by the state, not by the Nazi party. There is a difference there. So, SD is more loyal to the party, the Gestapo are just loyal to Germany. If that makes any sense. And the members, well, they used torture and persuasive techniques, and they essentially did their own thing. Now, the courts. They were judges, but these were under the control of Nazi. However, the people who enforced these courts and the people who transported people to these courts and were present in these courts were members of the SS. And who run the SS? Himmler. Well, the purpose was to uphold Nazi ideals and make sure that Nazi laws were being followed. They convicted political opponents, and they even had special courts, apart from the normal courts, which dealt with more Nazi, important cases to the Nazis. The members, well, the judges' career depended on them doing the regime's bidding. For every 5 judges, 3 of them were Nazis, and there was no jury present in any trial. The defendants had absolutely no rights to appeal their sentence. So if they were convicted, they just had to deal with it. If they were acquitted, good. But if they were convicted, I'm sorry. It is what it is. And then the concentration camps. Now, they were managed by the SS, but obviously the SS were recommended by Himmler, so Himmler. The purpose was, first, this is concentration camps, not extermination camps or work camps. Well, yeah, they're kind of work camps. Well, their main purpose was to punish political opponents. And like I said, they were controlled by the SS. So, there's obviously resistance to the Nazi regime. So, there are several types. There's nonconformity, resistance, like straight up resistance, and protest. So, nonconformity. Well, telling anti-Hitler jokes, that's a way of not conforming to the Nazi state. Hiding devotion or support for the Nazi party in public, so not hanging your Nazi swastika flag from your window. Also, not attending Nazi rallies. As well as, if you were a teacher, you could refuse to teach Nazi curriculum and teach your own curriculum instead. However, the SS did sometimes burst into classrooms and test the teachers, so that was kind of risky. Also, if you, for example, knew that your neighbor was a Jew, you could just not denounce them because, communist, whatever. Like if you knew someone was doing something that went against the regime, you could just not denounce them, and that's a form of non-conformity. Also, if you were a priest or gave church sermons, these would be anti-Nazis. Also, at home, you could refuse to put up Hitler's portrait because every home had to have one. And what I imagine most people did was they had the portrait next to a cabinet or whatever, and because sometimes members of the SS would just burst in, you have it available so that they could easily switch them and then let the SS member into their house and say, look, I'm a wonderful Hitler portrait. Also, refusing to attend Hitler youth events, that's also a form of nonconformity. If you were a child, just straight up refusing to do Nazi homework, for example, not focusing that much on eugenics. If you wanted to, nonconformity again, working with Jewish businessmen, also being openly homosexual, or straight up leaving the country. That is nonconformity, so hey. Next type is resistance. Well, one of the ways you could actually resist against Hitler was by planning a coup to overthrow or even kill Hitler. Also, not only Hitler, but other high-ranking members of the Nazi party, as well as spreading opposition propaganda and underground newspapers. The SPD could organize meetings and plotting with Germany's enemies, like Britain, France, doing graffiti, disrupting Nazi rallies, doing terrorist attacks. And I say terrorists because these attacks would be terrorists in the eyes of the Nazi regime, but in the eyes of nowadays, it probably would be seen as good. Also, breaking machinery, blocking the roads, and smuggling in foreign radios like the BBC. Another form was protest. So, striking in your workplace, refusing conscription, spreading anti-Nazi propaganda, in plebiscites and in the Reichstag, just voting no. Well, also not following Nazi legislation, setting up trade labor unions despite the fact that they were banned, and refusing to pay tax. Now, I've mentioned the types of resistance, and now I'm going to tell you the different resistance. Different types of, different cases of resistance there were. So first we have the SPD and SOPAID. SOPAID is the SPD in exile. Well, the form of resistance was by voting against the Enabling Act, by not showing up to work, by publishing newspapers, and by calling for strikes. The members consisted of around 300,000 people. They were left-wing and they were previous SPD members. The reason for their resistance was that They had completely different political ideologies, and they were kind of bitter because the SPD had been banned. And the impression was that in one of these strikes, 140 workers were arrested. Then, the KPD. Well, how did they resist? Well, they had newspapers, they passed from person to person. Yeah. The members were obviously communists and people in Munich and Berlin. The reason for resistance was that, well, they were, again, bitter because their own party was banned. However, they had very little communication. They couldn't just print out newspapers, so they had to do like from mouth to mouth, but that was really slow and they didn't get a lot of support. And by 1936, there weren't as many groups of the KPD. Then, in terms of workers, form of resistance, well, they did strikes. There were around 25,000 strikers at one of them, and 4,000 of them were imprisoned, and as well as not showing up to work or sabotaging your workplace. Members were those in the working class and those who formed part of the trade unions. Well, the reason for resistance was that the conditions were absolutely terrible, so they said, hey, can you improve our conditions? That's it. Then in terms of oppression, well, they were damaging the Nazi party's progress, so there were many arrests and many beatings. So yeah. Then in terms of Protestant church, well, I'm going to talk about the Protestant and Catholic church in a lot more detail in a second. So, one, the form of resistance was refusing to sign any act quite peacefully, defending church teachings, just not displaying the swastika whenever they were in church, but also just setting up the confessional church and straight up civil disobedience. Members were obviously Protestants and Jehovah's Witnesses. Well, the reason for resistance was that they wanted religious freedom. They wanted to protect their religion and didn't accept Hitler's Führer. The oppression, however, many were executed or sent to Dachau, in which many died. Salaries were stopped, and in 1937, 700 people were sent to prison. These were 700 Protestant pastors. Well, it was more oppression against individual people than against the church as a whole. Hey. Then you have the Catholic Church. Well, the form of resistance was with the papal letter with burning grief. Now, you're Pope Pius XI. You signed the Concordat with Hitler. And you're like, yay, Hitler's not going to interfere with us. What does Hitler do? Interfere with you. So you are very angry. But you're the Pope. So what do? Well, you publish a letter called With Burning Grief, essentially saying, oh my God, Hitler, I can't believe you've done this. What good does that do? That literally does nothing. Messengers went around announcing this letter, was speaking out, there was marching, but no. Do something else, not just send a letter. The reason for resistance was that the churches were being attacked and Catholic youth groups were being abolished. And the way in which they were oppressed, well, there was increased repression. 400 priests were sent to Dachau. Von Galen, however, was not arrested, and von Galen, he opposed the T4 program, but because he was a high-ranking member of the church, he was saved. And Catholics only consisted of 1/3 of society, but they weren't that huge, and civil disobedience wasn't organized. Then we have the White Rose. So the way in which they resisted was doing non-violent things, spreading pamphlets, anonymous leaflets, and letter campaigns. There were around 5,000 copies of the 6 leaflets they published. 50,000, I think I said 5,000. 50,000 copies. The members were young people, including Hans and Sophie Shaw, Sophie being the White Rose. They mainly concentrated on the University of Hamburg, and they mailed these letters and pamphlets to scholars. I think Sophie Shaw was around 14, so she was really young. And why did they resist? Well, They were against the behavior of German soldiers. They just didn't accept it. There was also discussed on what was happening on the Eastern Front and the treatment of Jews. This was way in the 1940s, by the way. In the way in which they were oppressed, well, Hans and Sophie Scholl were arrested by the Gestapo in 1943, and they were sentenced to death. Then we have Haro and Libertas. Well, the form of the resistance was through the group the Red Orchestra, in which they passed information to Stalin and collaborated with Stalin in many ways, including espionage. The way it goes, I think, was that, Haro, he is self-rising the Luftwaffe from the leftist beliefs, so he tells, sends a letter to Stalin saying, there's going to be this tactical movement, you should keep that in mind. And Stalin says, hey, I don't believe you, but this could be a trap. So he ignores it, but it ends up being true. Now Haro sends another letter saying this is the next tactical move. Stalin still doesn't believe him, and that ends up happening. So Stalin at one point says, okay, fine, we know you're telling the truth, you're going to work with me. The members was literally anyone who wanted, but they had to be trustworthy because it was completely confidential. Well, the reason for the resistance was because, like I said, the left wing, his leftist ideas stopped Haro from rising in the Luftwaffe. The way in which they were pressed was because a secret message from Stalin was decoded, and they were found and they were executed for treason. Then we have the swing youth and the Yas groups. Well, the form of resistance was by just listening to Western music, culture, and dance. Most people, the vast majority, if not all of them, they were under 21. These included the Edelweiss Pirates, and I'm going to talk about them in a second. And they wore outlandish clothing. The members, well, they were young people and people with enough money to be able to afford this, the music, the clothing. The reason for resistance was that, well, they had no political goal. They were just against the authority, and they wanted freedom, and they wanted different from classical ideas. So, resistance from the elites. Well, the form of resistance was, I forgot to say, sorry. The way in which they were oppressed was, at one point, 383 of them were arrested. 383. But it never ended up being a huge thing. So, resistance from the elites. The form of resistance. This was through newspapers, secret gatherings, conspiracies, and these people, because they were elites, they had access to Hitler on a daily basis. Well, the members were mainly army members, but also some industrialists. Well, the reason for resistance was that they feared they would go into another war, and they did, and they wanted the Kaiser back. However, these just were not enough people. So now, the Edelweiss Pirates. Well, the form of resistance they did was by ridiculing Hitler Youth members and Nazi Party members. And they gradually got more violent, and they also used music. They formed part of these swinging jazz groups. Well, in 1944, they did kill the Gestapo chief in Cologne, and I think 13 of them, 13, were executed. Then, in terms of the members, they were both young boys and girls, starting in the Rhineland, which, if I'm not mistaken, is not too far from where Goebbels was born. I think it was in the Rhineland, but I may be wrong, so don't hold me to that. No, I'm wrong. We'll get out of that. He wasn't born in the Rhineland. It was Speer who lived there. Sorry, I think. Anyway, continue. The reason for the resistance was that they opposed the Nazi control. And, well, they were executed, and that's that. So, propaganda, and this is possibly my favorite part of the whole course, is the way in which Goebbels, through the Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, controlled the people. Well, he used newspapers. By January 1933, there were 4,700 privately owned newspapers. The Nazis would later on limit the circulation of these. Well, the left-wing newspapers were closed in the decree for the protection of people in the state, so the emergency decree. And in 1933, NASDAQ bought 27 daily newspapers with 2.4 million circulating daily. News agencies were all merged into this one state-controlled organization, but they were banned, conformist, and just people thought, hey, if I'm gonna read the same thing in every newspaper, I'm just gonna stop buying it. The circulation gradually decreased, yeah. And there was also no freedom of press, no censorship, and any newspaper, legal newspaper that was published had to go through the Ministry of Propaganda. Then radios. Well, the Goebbels knew that the spoken word had much more impact than the written word. So he used these broadcasts to help the Nazis gain influence in the 1932 and 1933 campaigns. These broadcasts let Hitler speak to the people. In 1933 alone, he made 50 broadcasts. In squares and other parts of town, sirens and loudspeakers were set up so that Hitler, they announced when Hitler was about to speak, so everyone could rush home to listen to him, because everyone should listen to what the Führer had to say. Well, there was a huge mass production and sale of these radios. By 1939, 70% of households had radio, and 1 in 7 people have radio, which does not mean the same thing. Then the most famous one being the People's Receiver. It was really cheap. This was obviously promoted by Goebbels, and yeah, a lot of people, like I said, 70% of households and 1 in 7 people had a People's Receiver. The radio meant that people could access Hitler's speeches, and it felt like Hitler was in their home. This, but not really, but yes, kind of, is used by FDR after the 1933 elections, actually, with the whole fireside chats. So, I mean, it's obviously not the same thing, but the idea behind it is the same. All foreign radios, including the BBC, were banned, and there was a huge purge of radio workers, with 13% of staff being dismissed because of racial or political grounds. In April 1934, absolutely all radio was under the control of Reich Radio Company, controlled by Goebbels. In terms of film, well, Goebbels was a failed playwright, and he was a huge fan of cinema. And he knew the power and the potential film had as a form of propaganda, because it could deliver subliminal messages. So, for example, you were in a cinema and you were watching a movie, and, well, subconsciously you were thinking, oh, this idea that the movie puts forward is a good thing. And even in movies that had no propaganda whatsoever, the trailers that were put in front of the movie were propaganda too. So people were constantly being subjected to propaganda even in their free time. You can walk out in Nazi Germany and just not be surrounded by propaganda. Well, not him personally, but his ministry approved every single movie after 1933. And for any foreign movies were checked for political and racial content, but for some reason Disney was approved. From 1933 to 1945, over 1,000 films were produced, but attendance actually increased by 4 times between 1933 and 1944. Because people they were at war, they were desperate, they just needed some time away from the fighting and the grief, so they went to cinema. Only 14% of all movies were overtly political, and most of them were comedies, musicals, and or historical dramas. So they just I think 90% of movies had a propaganda message, but only 14% of them were openly political. And film had political messages, especially leadership, blood and honor, valor, hatred of Jews and communists were popular. blood, soul, and valor. And rewriting, like blood, soul, and valor, these are the values that they were most prominent. And whole rewriting history for the benefit of the Nazis. Well, that was kind of one of the goals. So whole parade and spectacles. In 1930, a new movement of modern political propaganda started emerging thanks to Goebbels. Like he said, good discipline is the best propaganda, and propaganda is flexible. He promoted the use of uniform, medals, banners, choreographed singing, carrying torches. If you were living in a block, you had to set up the swastika from your window, and there was a block leader, who would control that people were actually doing this. Well, any parade and flag waving was controlled by Goebbels, and it was just to show how the regime was being supported all throughout Germany. But of course, these spectacles were completely fabricated, and none of them were reality. And yeah, the whole September Nuremberg rallies were not only for the people, but also for theatrical effect. Again, propaganda. By 1936, there were over 100,000 people involved in these rallies. It showed strength, obedience, and unity, and, well, in Olympic stadiums, through the Brandenburg gates. These were really huge parades and everywhere. In terms of others, well, arts were an expression of race, and only Aryans were capable of making art. And degenerate art was the proof of racial decline, how Jews and communists and Roma and Sinti were just infiltrating German society and just screwing everything up for everyone. Well, if you wanted to make anything out of yourself, if you were an artist in Nazi Germany and wanted to make money, you needed to make artworks that portrayed Nazi ideals. On the 6th of May 1933, the whole burning of books, of 20,000 books, happened in Berlin, most notably books by Albert Einstein, and other actions followed on the 10th of May. And these books were deemed un-German, or their authors were because their authors were Marxists or Jews, or because they had a main character that was Marxist or Jew. A way in which if they didn't demonize the Jews and the Marxists, it was un-German. Also, in public buildings, there was a weekly poster of Nazi ideas displayed. So, in terms now that's propaganda, and that part's done. So, economy and economic recovery. So, Nazis do claim that they had an economic Nazis. People when analyzing this period, they do say that Nazis committed there was an economic miracle under the Nazis. So, I'm just going to tell you some of the features of a successful economy, and you can keep these in mind as I tell you the other features of Germany under the Nazis, and you can tell me if they had a successful economy. So in a successful economy, there are different business types. The prices are cheap. There's a wide variety of products. There's very low unemployment, very different types of jobs, inflation controls, increased GDP, high production, steady foreign exports and imports, a stable currency, low social inequality, disposable income, and higher wages. Just keep those in mind. Now, Hitler had 5 economic aims. First of all, eliminating unemployment and improving trade. Next is raising living standards. Next is achieving economic autarky. Next is rearming in readiness for war. Next one is improving relations with industrial elites. So, German economy can be separated into 3 stages. Now, the first one being Schat from 1933 to 1936, and this is a state of recovery. Then is rearmament, so Goering from 1936 to 1939. And then there's war with Albert Speer from 1939 to 1945. Now, I don't talk about Albert Speer because that's in Module 6, and I don't cover it here. So, I'm going to be evaluating Hitler's economic aims. So, first of all, eliminating unemployment and improving trade. Well, this was overall a success, kind of, because large sums of money were spent on the building of roads and public buildings, and increased industrial production through loans and tax relief. So basically, investment in infrastructure. The whole 1935 right to labor service, I talk about it in a second, was passed, which was quite effective. Unemployment went from around 6.16 million, although some historians now say it was around 9 million in 1933, to around 1.6 million. And I say it like that because, well, this number was probably inflated, but that was probably exaggerated, or whatever. Also, Shad put many controls on imports and access to foreign currency. Foreign trades increased, and there were many trade agreements initiated with the Balkans and South America. Military conscription was introduced to try and reduce unemployment, and supplied food and raw materials had to be paid in German Reichsmarks. And so they could only use this money to buy German goods and no other type of goods, just to boost the German economy. And like I said, the conscription was introduced in 1935, and this was for men aged 18 to 25. However, it was kind of a failure at the same because, well, yes, there was reduced unemployment, but this was because they managed to persuade women to quit via marriage loans. Also, many job creating schemes were made by Brüning in 1930, not 1933, so that wasn't the work of the Nazis. The economic recovery clearly began before the Nazis took over. And, well, conscription it was to reduce unemployment, but the reason why it did it is just because it took away a lot of the young males out of the labor market, so they couldn't work if they wanted to, so that helps reduce unemployment. The numbers of employment, like I mentioned before, are probably inflated, they're probably fake. And the actual figure should be not 1.6 million, but around 3 million. And the German motorway, also known as Autobahns, employ people, but they say that they employ a lot of people, but they only really employed 125,000. And ordinary people really can't afford cars. And I'm going to get into the cars thing in a second. Then the next aim was raising living standards. Well, propaganda campaigns really stressed how good the German economy was and the benefits that were available to people in Germany. This included improved working conditions, better social and welfare conditions, and goods and services. Incomes did genuinely increase, and pays and benefits tended to attract more and more skilled workers. Also, consumption of higher value foods such as meat, fruit, and eggs increased, and improved working conditions were present, and there was pay for government workers. Now, these improved working conditions are because of one of the Nazis' organizations for the workers. You'll see in a second. Also, the working hours were increased, which can be seen as a good thing because they could earn more money. The whole bonus schemes were implemented, and then the whole radio I mentioned before, and the Volkswagen veto. I'm going to talk about that more in a while. However, it's kind of a failure because, the workers' wages were subject to increased reductions because of the whole contributions they had to give to the German labor front. The prices did rise, but there was a general shortage of key commodities. And there were lower living standards for ordinary Germans in 1935 and 1936 than it's portrayed. It said that Germans lived really well, and in reality they didn't. The Gestapo, the so paid, clearly reported discontent with the regime, and they reported how there were food shortages, how the consumption of luxury goods were reserved for the elites, and how Volkswagen and other types of luxuries were, again, for the elites. So, rearming in readiness for war. It was kind of successful because the MIFO bills would allow the government to start the program in 1935 without any proper government funds. The government was able to pay for this military equipment through credit notes. There was also a mass collection of scrap metal to make up for shortages of raw materials. However, this, rather than being actual help, it was probably a propaganda stunt. Also, rearmament could be kept secret because these like the cost of like rearming wouldn't appear in the government's official accounts. Also, the 4-year plan was implemented, and this would make them ready for war. Now, the 4-year plan was implemented in 1935, and they went to war in 1939. So let's say that was a bit successful. And they created and managed an economy with controls on labor, supplies, prices, raw materials, foreign exchange. The Nazis knew what they were doing, and they were doing it quite well. They also set up production targets for private companies and established new state-owned industrial parks, most notably the Hermann Goering Steelworks. There was also an increase in production of the key commodities, which included, iron, steel, chemicals, that kind of stuff. Also, Nazis encouraged research and investment in the production of substitute products, such as artificial rubber and extracting oil from coal, which would reduce Germany's dependence on foreign imports. And by 1939, the German army was completely ready to invade Poland. So, failures. Well, it was kind of failure also because imports would use up valuable reserves of foreign currency, which would damage the rearmament program. The whole butter versus guns debate arose between should they invest money in guns in the war, or should they waste money by buying food for the people? And the Nazis decided to go to war. And they kind of ignored, they didn't really care about the people. Also, the 4-year plan wasn't as significant as propaganda claimed it to be. That was kind of a failure. And the balance of payments just kept on increasing. Next aim is the achieving economic autarky. In terms of successes, the propaganda campaign was passed to persuade people to only buy German goods, only use German raw materials, and persuade Germans to buy more, so just promoting German local businesses. Local committees were set up to coordinate these collections, and they aren't able to conduct foreign exchange. So that's kind of fun. The way in which they kind of failed at this because in order to maintain the levels of consumption, labor, and capital they had, in order to maintain economic autarky, they had to transfer these efforts of labor and capital to other industries. And what am I saying? No. So in order to achieve autarky, they couldn't focus on war that much. So they had sorry about that. So in order to achieve autarky, they couldn't focus on war that much. They had to focus more on improving their own industries at home. So they had to do that. So that kind of contributed to the loss of war because they had been fully focused they had done total war, things could have gone differently. Also, Germany still imported 1/3 of its raw materials, and they had similar failings in food production. Germany just did not have the resources it needed. And the next aim, and the last one, was improving relations with industrial elites. In terms of successes, the Mifu bills could be exchanged for cash at the Reichsbank. Also, companies were given an incentive to defer asking for the payment by the offer of 4% per annum interest on bills because they kept them for the 5-year term. So they said, hey, we can pay you back totally, but why don't you just stop asking us to pay it back? We'll give you a 4% per annum interest, and we're even. Obviously, none of these bills were paid back. There was a lot of suppression of the free trade unions and revival of the economy in general. A 4-year plan did give a lot of opportunities for businesses to make profits. And IG Farben, which fabricated the gases used in the concentration camps, they were involved in the research and production of synthetic materials. So profits in this area increased from 71 million Reichsmarks to 240 million. And these people are Hugo Boss, Krupp Steel, Thyssen. In terms of failure, it was a bit of a failure because there was greater intervention by the state in the economy, and there were controls on the supply of labor and raw materials and price controls. Also, the iron and steel firms were reluctant to invest in steelworks from poor quality and expensive German iron ore. Like, they knew they could do better, so why would they spend money on that? Why would they invest in it? And that is how Hitler managed his economic aims. Now, I mentioned how the whole economic miracle thing was being debated, so yeah, let's get to that. So, economic miracle, strong evidence. Well, the pay for overtime was really generous. There were higher wages, improved working conditions, and better health and health and safety and social conditions were, I guess. The canteens had subsidized hot meals, and athletic fields, parks, theater performances, concerts and exhibitions. These were all backed by the Nazi regime. Also, sports and hiking groups, dances, outdoor recreation courses, and again subsidized tourism, which I will get into in a second. They effectively managed to banish unemployment in just 4 years, although I kind of disagree with that. And then from 1932 to 1938, the gross real weekly earnings increased by 21%. Also, the rent remained stable, so that was kind of good. And while the prices declined for electrical appliances, clocks, watches, and food. So the total industrial production also increased from an index of 66 in 1932 to 125 in 1938. Unemployment rose to 12.6 million in 1932 to 18.8 million in 1938, higher than 18 million in the Golden Age. Also, public expenditure in Germany rose from 17.1 billion Reichsmarks in 1932 to 37.1 billion Reichsmarks in 1938. National income did increase from 42.6 billion marks in 1932 to 79.8 billion marks in 1938. Big businesses also took a 116% increase in income. And the GMP increased from 58 billion Reichsmarks in 1932 to 105 billion in 1938. 41% of farmers had an increase in income, and by this point, economic autarky was kind of being achieved, with bread being 120% self-sufficient. It just shows how there's quite a lot of evidence for there to be a economic miracle. In terms of weak evidence, well, the Volkswagen scheme was established in 1937, and this was in order to get everyone to own their own car. The Beetle was designed to transport two adults and 3 children at a speed of around 100 kilometers an hour. And the Volkswagen savings scheme was to build up around 990 Reichsmarks, and they were quite effective. The real wages going back to Volkswagen, people were told to put a small amount of money in their accounts every day or every week or whatever, and by the time the 4-year plan was over, they would have a car. But no one who used the Volkswagen scheme ever received the Beetle or even a refund. Also, real wages increased from 7.5%. Real wages increased 7.5% between 1936 and 1938, and unemployment decreased from 6.16 billion in 1932 to 0.2 million in 1938. But this doesn't take into account any hit in unemployment. So then the whole propaganda myth. I gave you a lot of evidence for the economic miracle, but now it's turned to to argue if this was all just a huge propaganda myth. So there was a general decrease in food consumption from 1927 to 1932. 1927 to 1937. The biggest decrease being that in a 58.7% decrease in beer. Also, no family, like I said, that used the Volkswagen scheme ever received a car, so that was kind of a scam. I did mention how hours increased, and that was kind of good, but also bad because You had to work more. In 1933, the average working week was 43 hours, but by 1939, the average working week was 47 hours. Nowadays, it's 40 hours, so just like a bit of contrast. Factories stopped being used to produce like goods; they started to be used to build armored vehicles. And by 1939, all production had stopped that wasn't focused on the war. There was a whole lot of inflation, and there was still invisible unemployment of around 1.5 million. In the Ottomans, at peak employment rate was 125,000. And there were a lot of arguments of the consumer goods, so the whole guns versus butter debate. Imports and exports never received pre-crash, never reached the levels they had before the crash, and there were an index of 14 imports versus 12.3 exports, and even 1/3 of all German goods were being imported. I mean, a bit of weak evidence was that, there was a bit of self-sufficiency, especially in bread grains and sugar, which increased over 100%, but most wasn't really self-sufficient. So fish was around 50%, like dependent. So, education. There's like two parts: schools and universities. So schools. In 1933, there was a vetting of textbooks. In 1933, I set the law for the reestablishment of the professional civil service, dismissed many teachers, and it was unreliable because they deemed these teachers unreliable and even Jewish. You have to know how they saw Jews as being like aliens. Also, the Ministry of Education issued many central directives in 1935. 1937, 97% of teachers belonged to the NSLD. In 1938, laws were passed to covering the school year in most subjects. So in geography, they would be taught Lebensraum, blood and soil. In history, they would be taught the history of the Treaty of Versailles and the history of World War I, the whole success in the Franco-Prussian War, but it was entirely subjective. For physical education, they had military drills, about competition in strength, boxing, and this formed 15% of the curriculum. In terms of culture, they studied Nordic sagas, and they explored this idea of the consciousness of being. In biology, they taught eugenics, and there was a lot of stress on race and heredity. In terms of religion, this was completely off the curriculum, and this was replaced by a similar idea, kind of the Hitler myth. In language, they really stressed the importance of German. And every day at the beginning, they would have to take a class of German. Then universities. Well, universities were forced to do 4 months labor service and 2 months in any SA camp. Also, surprisingly, 25% of students have actually avoided joining the German Students' League, the DS. So, if you ask me, that's really impressive. In November 1933, the university staff had to sign the Declaration in support of Hitler and the National Socialist State. And then the whole law for the reestablishment of the professional civil service, 1933, meant that 1,200 people were dismissed from the staff, and around 15% of total, 1.5% of all the university population was Jewish, and 10% of girls went to university. Only 10%. Yes, higher education was strictly rationed too, so that was kind of hard. This would go on to have an effect later on. Then, youth groups in Nazi Germany. Well, Hitler Youth, the leader was von Schirach, and their motto was "Live faithfully, fight bravely, and die laughing." These were kids, and in their motto they had to say "die laughing." All other youth organizations were banned or taken over by 1933. And in 1938, a law for the incorporation of the German youth was passed, which they put this official education movement equal in status of that of schools. In 1936, a monopoly over sports facilities and children's competitions under the age of 14 was present. all Catholic youth groups were banned. The membership in the Hitler Youth was compulsory by 1939, and before it had amassed huge numbers of popularity, but it wasn't compulsory. They had this political and physical indoctrination, and well, boys from the age of 10 were being prepared to be warriors. They swore a personal oath of allegiance to the Fuhrer, like not even a general oath of allegiance, a personal one too. And well, they were taught Nazi songs and even were encouraged to read any Nazi pamphlet that came their way. It was an opportunity to participate in sports and camping trips, so young boys would see this and say, "Oh my God, that's really appealing. Mom, can I go there?" And the moms would take them and they would join the Hitler Youth. There was a general, as the years went on, a general decline in participation because the youth began to feel claustrophobic as if their freedoms were being taken away. And the whole struggle, sacrifice, loyalty, and discipline became the norm for a lot of these kids. In 1933, 100,000 members formed part of the Hitler Youth. 1936, 8.75 million members, even though the real figure is probably closer to 4 million. There, in terms of the BDM, the leader was Jutta Rudiger, who, by the way, was a homosexual too. She was lesbian. Their motto was "Be faithful, be pure, be German." And it was, in other words, the female equivalent of the Hitler Youth. They were prepared, and they were being prepared for their future role as housewives and mothers under Volksgemeinschaft. The whole blood and soil idea was being propagated so that you had to marry a good German man. They thought their duty was to were taught that their duty was to keep their bodies healthy because these bodies would produce babies, and these babies would belong to the nation, and they wanted these babies to be loyal to Hitler and be raised and be raised by a mother who would promote Nazi ideals and be born without defects. And if the baby was born defective, well. Also by 1939 as well, membership became really compulsory, and formation dancing included gymnastics, race fitness, and even developed comradeship. They were instructed in hygiene and healthy eating, and there were sessions also for political education, cooking, stewing, and handicrafts. There were a lot of summer camps organized for them, including physical exercise, route marches, indoctrination, flag waving, saluting, whatever. Faith and beauty groups instructed baby care and social skills. So ballroom dancing, more traditional women roles. So now that is youth. Now let's talk about workers. So there were 3 organizations, well, really one, which I had in turn 2 mini organizations. So let's start with the German Labor Front, the DAF. Well, the way it brought about positive changes for women was by eventually build this enormous business empire, including banks, housing associations, construction companies, the whole Volkswagen plant, and travel companies. In 1939, it had 44,500 paid employees. By 1936, they also started offering vocational training courses to improve the workers' skills. Around 2.5 million workers attended. And by 1936, the average wage of a worker was around 35 marks per week, which was 10 times as much money as 6 million people had relied on in 1932. However, negative changes for workers. Well, it was established in May 1933 under the leadership of Robert Ley. It took over the assets of all the banned trade unions and became the largest single organization in the Third Reich. It had its own propaganda wing to promote the message that people's hard work and difficult conditions could be rewarded, not with anything material, but with the satisfaction of knowing that they would be serving the fatherland. And if I was a German worker, I'd call BS on that. I'd want money. Unless they weren't completely indoctrinated by propaganda. Also, it replaced trade unions, but didn't really function as a trade union. It was more for like controlling the people because it was easier to control them. They were just under one group, had no real intention in influencing government or even bargaining for wages. Also, inside the DAF, it included the Right Labor Service, or the RAD, which in 1935 obliged all men aged between 19 and 25 to complete 6 months of national service, so agricultural labor or public works, which were often far from home and with terrible pay. But they used their hands, they used the soil. It was like promoting, yeah, blood, soil, and valor. Its members included both employers and employees, but it was heavily weighted towards securing the rights of the employers and big business owners rather than the employees, some of the workers. And in terms of unusual changes, well, it was the only recognized body representing the workers, but its membership never became compulsory, but by 1939, there were 35 million people involved. It was the only officially recognized body representing the work. We'll set that again. Yes. Like, yeah, it was the only official recognized body representing the workers. Like, is another point, sorry. Which meant that, like, yeah, they get a lot of support, but also they could, like I said before, they could control them. So the workers, they saw, like, this group and they joined and said, okay, let's try and bargain for like, stuff. And the Nazis were like, oh, yeah, you want better working conditions? Great, you're going to pay for that yourself. And, well, I'm going to talk about this in a second. And they had just two main aims: to incorporate workers in the Volksgemeinschaft and to increase production. So, the two organizations I'm going to talk about are the Strength Through Joy and the Beauty of Work. So, first of all, the Strength Through Joy, the KDF. Well, positive change for the workers. Well, they were an arm of the DAF designed to allow workers to gain strength for their work by experiencing joy in their leisure time. It organized a lot of subsidized holidays abroad, most famously cruises to Finland, Norway, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Libya. It organized sporting activities and hikes, trips to the opera, to the theater, to the cinema. They had like really amazing programs. It also aimed to encourage the spirit of social equality because all activities were organized in a one-class basis. Now, this one class was the Aryan class. If you were not Aryan, you were not allowed to participate. Well, these cruise ships were designed to show the technological advancement of Nazi Germany and to show Germans how superior they were to the people of the nations they visited. So, of course, if you were in Norway and you saw this German Nazi ship pass by, well, you be like, oh my god, I want to live in Nazi Germany. And then Norway obviously got conquered. They also offered facilities including the gym, swimming pools, theaters, and they offered many opportunities which had not existed before 1933. So it became an extremely popular program. Established by the regime. The uptake was really high. So to give you an idea, in 1938, 2 million people went on these organized hikes. 7.5 million went to the theater. 8 million took part in these KDF organized holidays, and 22 million people took part in the organized sport. And there were some negative changes for the workers, however, because, well, yeah, this was all leisure and fun and all, but one of the true purposes was to allow the regime to control what the workers were doing in their free time. So they promoted these, like, activities, people would do them, and they had literally no free time to indulge in non-Nazi activities. And however, like they promoted social equality, but in reality, this cruise ship, like, tickets were extremely expensive. Only 10% of passengers came from the working class. In 1938, just 131,000 people went on the cruise. And, the best cabins were reserved for party officials and civil servants. And even when you were on the cruise, if you managed to get a ticket, obviously, well, the life was extremely regimented. If you went, you had to dress moderately and avoid excessive drinking and steer clear of any romances. And in order to ensure this, members of the SS and Gestapo were present in these boats. There were some neutral changes. It did attempt to bring Germans from different regions together to form a more national rather than local identity. Some people from Bavaria, people from Munich, like people from all over Germany, Dresden, whatever. Then also was responsible for the Volkswagen savings scheme. It offered workers a chance to own a Beetle by just saving five marks a week, but well, this ended up not working because whole government program, that was a scam. The next organization I'm going to look at, the last one, is the Beauty of Work, so the SDA. It provided some positive changes for workers because it did campaign for better washing facilities, canteens, workplace sporting grounds, and general improvement of the factory sites. So these were in a better, general improvement of factory sites, so these were better conditions. There were some negative changes for the workers too, however, because, well, most of these improvements had to be paid for and carried out by the workers themselves. So, for example, they went up to the Nazi representative and say, hey, we want to paint the walls of the factory because we believe this would boost morale. The Nazi would say, okay, fine, no problem, 100%. But you will buy the paint yourselves and you will paint it yourself. So, you can buy it, you can do it totally, I'm not going to stop you, but you have to do everything yourself. They also built new facilities and installed new equipment. There were some neutral changes, so it was an organization devoted to improving working conditions in order to make Germans work harder and secure the health and hygiene of the Aryan race. They weren't concerned about the individual, they were concerned about the individual passing on any distress into the children and then making the Aryan race less glorious, I guess. According to Nazi figures, so the fact that this is Nazi figures, you can't really trust them, but 1938, more than 34,000 companies had improved working conditions at a cost of around, or even more than, 900 million Reichsmarks. So, the church in Nazi Germany. I'm going to divide this into different churches, so Catholic Church, Protestant Confessional Church, and the Reich Church. So, the Catholic Church. Key information. It was led by Pius XI up until 1939, after which Pius XII took over. There were around 6 archbishops, 19 bishops, and 20,000 priests, and they were more present in the north and east, so more in Berlin. They formed 22 million people, so if you want the percentage, around 32%. And they also had youth organizations with around 1.5 million members, and they were present in schools and in charities. A notable member being von Galen, but they were hard to control. They had a loyalty to God and to the Pope, not to Hitler. They did have political parties, so the Catholic Center Party was controlled by the Catholic Church. And, well, the whole with burning grief Pius XI letter, which I said it once, but it's just useless. It's just stupid. Anyway, the Nazi policies towards the Catholic Church. Well, after 1935, 1936, public meetings of the church were restricted. Newspapers were heavily censored, and propaganda campaigned against the corruption. The Catholic youth also struggled to hold on to their members because many flocked to the Hitler Youth. In 1937, the Gestapo and the SS were now present in church, but would also put them at ease and forced members of the church to hold up Nazi the swastikas. They tightened restrictions on Catholic press, propaganda, and they had propaganda on many sex scandals, which involved around 200 priests. Pilgrimages and processions were all restricted, and many monasteries were closed down. So this can kind of reflect a bit, not a lot, but a bit Henry VIII and Elizabeth and Edwardian Reformation. And well, of course, the whole Concordat signing of 1933, which I know I've said it again. I'll get really annoyed by this because it's really stupid. I know, but this time they had no reason to doubt Hitler, but they signed the Concordat on the 20th of July, fine. The church would attack Hitler, Hitler didn't attack the church, but then when Hitler just doesn't do this, he attacks the church, just posting a pamphlet is not going to do anything. So, what is some of the evidence the Nazis succeeded in controlling it? Well, obviously the Concordat signed on the 20th of July, my birthday, showed how they respected other people's roles. And the SA were ordered to attend the church not as SA, but as normal citizens. Not dressed as normal citizens, just in their free time, go to church. Von Galen, who was the Bishop of Munster, actually thanked the Fuhrer for remilitarizing Rhineland and even blessed him. His opposition would go on. I'm going to talk about his opposition later on. Well, in 1937, 200 priests were put on trial for currency trafficking offenses and also many sex scandals. In 1939, Cardinal Faulhaber orders a celebration because Hitler suffered an assassination attempt and he survived. So this cardinal celebrated it. And then 1940, the churches actually welcomed the attack on the USSR. All of them did. However, there is evidence that showed how the Nazis failed in controlling the Catholic Church. So, Nazism and general Christianity had opposite beliefs. In Bavaria, even though Bavaria was mostly Protestant, even when there was still Catholicism there, when you went to Bavaria, they would greet you with "God be with you," rather than "Heil Hitler." The war made people go back to religion because in times of desperation, people tend to go back to their faith. And they had really no opportunity to they just needed comfort in there, and they found that in their faith. Also, I'm gonna say this again. Well, this really annoys me. Pope Pius XI, after the failure of the Nazi Party to keep the words agreed on in the Concordat, he issues a public text called "Whispered in Greek." It's stupid. Then Bishop von Galen, he preaches several sermons criticizing Nazi ideologies. So mainly in 1941, his opposition of the T4 program was really successful because he actually managed to stop the program. And he was there was an attempt to imprison him, but because he was too high up in the church hierarchy, he got out. He didn't even get arrested. He just didn't. He's avoided getting arrested. Then crucifixes were banned, which created many problems and protests, especially in places like Bavaria, because you can't really ban crucifixes. People are gonna get angry. It's their religion. Then in terms of the Protestant Confessional Church, I'm just gonna talk about that. It's a bit of key information. Martin Niemöller and Dietrich Bonhoeffer established the Pastors' Emergency League in September 1933. They established a confessional church in 1935, and these were 5,000 clergy. The theology was purely based on the Bible and nothing else, so not the Hitler myth. They posed a significant amount of opposition to the Reich Church. I'm going to talk about the Reich Church in a second. Or the South and the West, rather to Bavaria, yes, they were, they were mostly Protestant, but they did have some pockets of Catholicism, like I mentioned. They formed 45 million people, so around 58% of the population, and they broke away from the Reich Church in 1934, the Protestant Church, to form the Confessional Church. The Protestant churches broke away from the Reich Church in 1934, and the Confessional Church was officially founded in 1935 by, like I said, Martin Niemöller and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. They also had youth organizations, and they had political parties such as the DVP and the DMVP, so more right-wing rather than the center Catholic Party. well, this isn't really surprising because Lutheranism, did start in Germany and was nationalist in nature, quite like the Nazi regime, but obviously not really. In 1934, two Protestant bishops were arrested, but they were released after public outcry. In like that same year, I think 700. I like this because it's 700 Prussian Protestant pastors, so 700 PPP, were arrested for condemning Nazi neo-paganism. The Confessional Church, well, they exploited divisions, marginalized Christians, and repression, and it was direct defiance of the whole policy of Gleichschaltung. At first, the Nazis did encourage essay weddings and Nazis' attendance at services through the but through the Protestant church. But later on, obviously not. So, what is the evidence that the Nazis succeeded in controlling the Protestant church? Well, the Reich Church was founded mainly to control Protestant churches. Also, the whole 700 PPP Protestant pastors, in Prussia. Then 1940, they also welcomed the attack on the USSR, since it wasn't only the Catholic Church, it was also the Protestants. And, the SA were ordered to attend the church. So, is there any evidence? Well, obviously there is. What is the evidence that the Nazis kind of failed in controlling it? Well, the Nazis wanted and created this unified Reich Church, but it really failed because the Confessional Church ended up breaking away, led by Martin Niemöller and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. This church was made to resist Nazi ideology and had the support, like I said before, of 5,000 priests, pastors. Several areas even went to the Confessional Church because they wanted to celebrate the church festivals in the traditional way, in the Protestant way, not this new Nazi way. And that's pretty much it. And now the Reich Church. So key information: Ludwig Müller was now a Reich bishop, and it was just a collection of Protestant churches that merged together in 1936. So the Reich Church idea, a group was made in 1934, but then the Reich Church beliefs were really made final in 1936. It was the whole doctrine of positive Christianity was now it was the doctrine of positive Christianity, which was now compatible with Nazism. According to Hitler himself, you can't be a Christian and a German. So if you wanted to, you could be positive Christianity, and this would be acceptable, not encouraged, but acceptable. So, what are some of these policies towards the church? So Hitler believed in, like I said, positive Christianity. He was raised Catholic, but ended up abandoning that, and there was really no coherence. And he said, and I quote, "You need to stamp out Christianity in root and branch. One is either a Christian or a German. You can't be both." Lee Borman Heydrich wanted complete reform. He disliked atheists. Jesus was a Jew, and oh God, how could people worship a Jew? And German Christians were not Aryan, and you could be Aryan if you converted back. I don't know. You could be a Christian and a German. So they created therefore they created this whole unified Protestant Reich Church. As I mentioned before, Ludwig Müller as Reich bishop. In 1936, the NSLB encourages not to teach religion in schools. Instead, teach the Hitler myth. In 1937, 200 priests are put on trial for currency trafficking. Crosses are all banned from school, but then they're reinstated because of public outcry. And the church secession campaign happened to persuade renouncing of Christianity. They said that only 5% were God believers, and if you were one of them, you should just renounce it right now. But obviously, more than 5% of the German population were God believers. I think it was 32% of the Catholic Church and 58% of the Protestant Church. So you can't say that it's only 5%. Party members, if you wanted to be a Nazi like party official, you could not hold office in any church. So evidence the Nazis succeeded in controlling it. Well, obviously it's a part of Nazi ideology, so they obviously succeeded. So Nazis supported Protestant groups, and because they were more nationalist in nature, that's why the Reich Church is based in Protestantism. Although, I mean, they don't. It's a modified version of Protestantism. Well, demands cleansing of Gospels and any German themes. Also, German Christians had to say that there was a swastika on her breast and gun on her heart, and then the whole Horst Wesel or Wesel, or how you pronounce that, was a martyr. So then the last part, and I know it's a long video, I'm sorry, I didn't think it would be that long, but again, it is about the Nazi dictatorship, Nazi regime, so what did you expect? So Nazi policies towards women. There's 3 Ks. So first of all, it's kinder. And kinder is aimed towards like children, I mean, kindergarten. Well, to produce, they wanted women to produce children and raise them with Nazi values, and then donate these children to the Fuhrer, so educate them so that they would obey Nazi ideas, and then join the Hitler Youth, and then serve in the army, and possibly die for Hitler. Then you have Krush, which was a kitchen, I think it is, or family. I think it's family. Yes. They produce food for the husband and the family. Only the husband should work, and from 1937 to 1939, women work rose from 5.9 to 6.9 million. But they went from like 37% to 31% of the population, so it's not really, Then Kirch, I think that's church. They kept traditional Protestant values. They shouldn't worship God. They should only worship Hitler. So, what should the ideal physical appearance of a Nazi woman be? They have to be Aryan, strong, had wide hips in order to bear Aryan children, to wear simple clothing made out of German cotton, to be a housewife, like I said, these wide hips, and like have the ability to like keep up a home. Absolutely no drinking or smoking, no makeup, and if you had a hereditary disease or were considered asocial, and more asocials are more module 5, so there's more discrimination towards asocials, but that's not really relevant. Well, if you considered you had a hereditary disease or were asocial, you should be sterilized, and 375,000 women did this. So, any groups and institutions? Of course, there were so many groups in Nazi Germany. So, first of all is the NSF, so the National Socialist Womanhood Group. There were 2.3 million members, so it was quite popular, but these again are official Nazi figures, so how can you really trust these? The leader was Gertrude Scholze-Klink, was the Nazi woman wing, and they had wing, and they had no real political power. And then we have the German Women's Enterprise, the DFW. They had to work on the appeal skill. They had 6 million members, and it was compulsory for women organizations. The leader was again Gertrude Scholze-Klink, and they ensured women had beliefs. If you were a woman this time, you were allowed to have beliefs. You were allowed to have your own opinion. Of course, this opinion had to be according to Nazi ideas. If it wasn't according to Nazi ideas, you couldn't have your opinion. But you could have it as long as it was promoting Nazi ideas. Not joining, if you were a woman group, you could be a group could be restricted or even banned. So the last section, and I swear this is the last thing I'm going to talk about, is marriage and children. So in the 1920s, the birth rate had been decreasing. Well, at first they did increase, but then they decreased because women their lives got busy, their careers took over, they didn't have time to take care of kids. And, sometimes they even got sterilized as an excuse to get divorced. So the Nazis came up with this policy of the Honor Cross. These were like an award given to women. They had children, so if you wanted the Bronze Honor Cross, you had to have 4 children. If you wanted the Silver Honor Cross, you had to have 6 children. If you wanted the Gold Honor Cross, you had to have 8 children. And there were also marriage loans in which, these were 600 Reichsmarks, no interest. And if you had, for every child you had, women didn't have to pay 25% of their loan. So if you had 4 children, you didn't have to pay a single cent. And then the last thing in the Nazi policies towards women, especially in the terms of women, marriage and children, is a whole thing of Lebensborn. Now, don't confuse Lebensbraun with Lebensborn. They do sound similar, but obviously they're not the same thing. So this is organized in 1935 by Himmler, because who else? And it involved members of the SS. Not surprising. And they even did these programs in castles. This program is also called the Fountain of Life. They were responsible for 8,000 children being born in Germany. 60% of the women involved in this program were actually unmarried. And they even had many maternity homes with 10 facilities in Germany alone. Although there were some facilities, especially in the war, in Norway and other European countries. The baby would be allowed to be with the mother for 2 weeks, but then they would be given to a racially pure family, because some of the women in the program were not racially pure. If you were racially pure, you could keep it. But if you weren't, well... Also, because only 40% of the women in the program were racially pure. And then in 1935, there was kind of a little program to kidnap the babies, in which 100,000 babies were kidnapped. And well, if women didn't collaborate, if they didn't give the baby up, if just didn't collaborate, they were sent to concentration camps. And that is it. That is module 4 of the Nazi dictatorship. So yeah, thank you for watching. I hope it helped. And sorry it was really long. I really thought it would be shorter. So yeah, thank you for watching. Bye.